Okay. So anyway, so I felt after my last talk about grief, I felt it was unfinished, and there's so much to say about grief. And once you start diving into it, you're traversing a landscape that we tend to ignore in our lives. And but the fact is that grief is really never finished. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how deeply connected grief is to dukkha, which is the Sanskrit word that's usually translated as suffering. But suffering is probably, has in English, it has its own set of meanings, and the word tends to narrow it a little bit, narrows dukkha. So I think it's helpful to add grief into dukkha, because it's so pervasive. And the a recent edition of This American Life, I don't know, do other people listen to This American Life sometimes? Yeah. So it's about, if some maybe some of you listen to this edition, it's about grief and its many forms. And one of the hardest things about grief is that it can be isolating, instead of connecting. And one of the grieving people, a man whose almost 3-year-old son died of a brain tumor, talked about how people were uncomfortable with his pain. They wanted him to feel better, he felt, to alleviate their discomfort, their fear, and their not knowing what to do. And somehow we, in our society, we've felt that both for ourselves and for other people, that we're all supposed to make grief better. We're supposed to get over it. And we talk about appropriate grief, and we talk about grief that is excessively prolonged and things like that, and we label it and diagnose it to death, like we do so many other things. And but what this man wanted was to be real. He wanted to be real with it, to be allowed to express his terrible grief fully and naturally, so as to allow it to dissipate and follow its own natural course. Not being able to in fact, he wanted not to have to soothe the fearful feeling of others. And having to soothe their feelings was like a second arrow of grief for him, because there was something that was deeply missing for him from his life, along with the loss of his son. But in Zen, we work with suffering and grief in a different way, and the inner work that we take on is to find the safe and vast inner container of compassion and wisdom for our own suffering. And this is the place where we can see and know our grief, our suffering, so as to be able to be present to that of others, to be able to be the friend with the friend who has lost a child. But we don't take it on in order to serve others. We take it on in order to find that capacity within ourselves. It's a slightly different um, uh, charge that we take on. Recently, one of my cousins died. Her name was Deborah, and she was the daughter of one of my first cousins, Jimmy. Jimmy was 6 months younger than I, and so we grew up together. And I think Jimmy may have been I don't know whether he was a psychopath or something like that. I think he probably had something really off. He was, as a young boy, he was expelled from a lot of schools for discipline problems. He was a mean kid, I remember, and then later he went to prison for dealing marijuana, which doesn't seem like a big deal now, but that it was, 50 years ago. And later he became an importer of cocaine and heroin. He died of a heroin overdose when he was 35, leaving a wife and two teenage girls, one of whom was Deborah. We lost track of that family after Jimmy died for several years. But their mother, Dorothy, also died at an early age, probably from a drug-related death. I didn't know Jimmy's children well. I had seen Deborah only 2 or 3 times in her short life. The last time was about 10 years ago at a family reunion, and it was obvious that she had had a hard life. This week, I received an email about her unexpected death. She had been in a car accident about a couple of weeks ago and was thought to be recovering when she was found dead. I think it's not unlikely that she died of a drug overdose. And I think, I don't know, I don't remember exactly how old she was, but I think maybe in her early 50s. So I was looking around for, I'm not close to her sister, but we are in contact. We're Facebook friends and we always exchange Christmas cards and things like that. And I was looking around for a card to send her. And I have a habit of browsing and collecting cards, including condolence cards. And so I was looking for a condolence card to send to Heather. And there just isn't a condolence card to send to Heather about her father, her mother, and her only sister. There's just no card for that. There's just no card that I can imagine that could hold Heather's grief. The journal teacher, Ira Progoff, some of you may be familiar with his work, he said that grief is a solitary journey that we cannot do alone. We each have to do the inner work, and we each do it differently. Some people need to do it very privately. We must do this inner work. It is necessary as a human being to do it. And then what we find from doing that is the ability to offer that same presence to others. All cultures have ways of expressing grief publicly. And these public ways are often rituals. One of the hardest things about the pandemic, I think, for people has been the deprivation of ritual and the deprivation of the ability to be in community surrounding the loss of people, the loss of life. Public rituals bind us together and connect us. To a bereaved person, just showing up and being in their presence often is enough and is probably the most important thing. It's not so much having the best card or a good card or sending good flowers or something like that, or even being able to say the right thing. It's really just being able to be there. But often people are so in fear of grief and so in fear of seeing the pain of other people that we think that we have to have the right thing to say. And really the only thing that matters is our presence. And I think that's actually something that Zen has to offer to the field of grief work, because it's the ability to be present to suffering that is our work. That is the Four Noble Truths. Often it's just enough to reach out a hand and to look into a bereaved person's eyes. Then they feel seen and understood, and it's a great solace. Every grief raises all other griefs. Deborah's death is for me a reminder of so many deaths in my family, so much of what is lost and will be lost. Deborah was named after her paternal grandmother, who also died young of a brain tumor. Her name was we called her Aunt Deb. Aunt Deb, Jimmy, Dorothy, and now Deborah, all in the same family. And my own mother died of lung cancer when she was 50. Why do we ignore grief? We've often read about the idea that the paucity of ritual in our death-defying culture is to blame. And I think there's something to be said about that. We don't get time off work for grief. I remember one of the doctors where I worked expressing surprise at how emotional one of her colleagues was who had lost her father, from whom she had been estranged. But loss of someone with whom you have a difficult relationship is harder in some ways than the loss of someone with whom you have a good relationship, because there's nothing unfinished or unexpressed or undone. So in losing someone with whom you have a difficult relationship evokes all the grief related to what the relationship lacked. So where do we put all of that? And here's what I think. We mourn. I think we've lost the permission to mourn and to mourn publicly. And I believe in actively mourning. Mourning publicly is a personal choice. But I often recommend personal mourning. I still grieve the loss of my mother. She died of lung cancer. When she died, I couldn't sleep, and I didn't know what had hit me, and I had no idea how to deal with it. I had to go back to work, and someone said, "How was your vacation?" And I said, "My mother died," and she said, "Oh." One time I was talking to Alan Senauke, who is now the abbot of Berkeley Zen Center, and he told me that he had had a difficult relationship with his father. And he had decided to put a picture of his father on his altar and do nothing but bow to him every day, bow to his father every day. And gradually his relationship, his grief changed and evolved to a deeper acceptance. And I've done something with my mother's picture, and I often recommend something similar, sometimes accompanied by a mantra or a prayer. And last year, I made a Day of the Dead altar for the first time to commemorate those who had died of COVID. And then I added more names and photos, because as I thought of the people who died last year, I remembered so many others. One of the segments in This American Life is about the George Floyd Memorial in what came to be called George Floyd Square in the crossroads near where he was killed. And I have a screen share of that for you. In case you haven't seen it. Okay, yeah, okay. So, and this was a spontaneous outpouring of the expressions of grief of hundreds and hundreds of people, and it kept evolving over the last year, more and more. And it's recently been dismantled, but This American Life interviewed a woman who had dedicated her offering to maintaining it, cleaning it, pruning plants, disposing of dead flowers and tattered signs. And sometimes she said that sometimes when she was doing it, people would come up and just stand next to her. And sometimes they'd talk to her. And she would just listen to their grief. And she said one of the things that she had learned was that protest is born out of grief, that grief and protest are inextricably connected. I think that grief needs to find an expression. One of the most poignant experiences that I had in my priest training was an experience of a ceremony called Mizuko Kuyo, which is the Japanese ceremony of memorial service for infants who died before birth in miscarriage or abortion, or who died soon after birth. A wonderful teacher from Oregon, Jan Chozen Bays, has written a book about this practice and has adapted it for American life and for other purposes as well, not just for the death of infants. And another Zen priest, Chris Fortin, from Northern California, taught this version to us in our priest training class. And she had expanded it to include other deaths and losses, including divorce and estrangement, and circumstances in which you've done harm to another person. And she includes the themes of forgiveness and offering forgiveness. The ritual takes several hours. There's a statue of Jizo on the altar, and I also have a screen share of Jizo so that you can see what Jizo looks like. This is actually just a drawing of Jizo. And maybe this looks familiar to you. So it's often he looks somewhat like a child, and sometimes he's pictured holding a baby or holding food or something like that. And he's a popular Japanese expression of Avalokiteshvara, and you will see in graveyards often you'll see statues of Jizo, and they are decorated in some way. And so this is what Chris adapts by, and this is what happens. So she puts out a table with red cloth and sewing implements, scissors, needles and thread, and things like that. And the instruction is to imagine that Jizo embodies someone you have lost or someone that you've harmed. And then you cut out and construct a little garment of your own design to clothe and protect Jizo. And you take as long as you need. And it doesn't require any kind of skill. And it can be very simple. And you do it thoughtfully, sewing your grief into every stitch. And thinking about what happened and the person that is gone or that you harmed. There were about 12 people on the day that I did it. And after a couple of hours, we'd all finished our garments. And we stood in a circle and bore witness in silence as each one of us went forward and offered our clothing, speaking words of regret, sorrow, guilt, or apology. And many people wept. My project was about the death in labor of a baby of one of my patients. Ultimately, the cause was something unpreventable. But I knew that I had not wanted to go to the hospital that day, and that I had delayed, and that whether or not my selfish wishes had anything to do with the baby's demise, it would have been better if I had been there sooner. And sewing the garment and offering it to the baby and his mother, crying and apologizing and being witnessed, soothed my heart by acknowledging my failure and my responsibility. So it was not an empty ritual. The George Floyd Square was not an empty ritual. Our gathering together here, even on Zoom, is not an empty ritual, except that it is empty of self, because fortunately we're not alone. This is Sangha and the meaning of Sangha: community, mourning, and celebrating together. Thank you, everyone.